Good morning and welcome to the Arbitrary and Capricious podcast. This is episode 3. Today is March 11th, 2018, and I am Aaron Robinson, and I have your co-host here.
I'm Jay Reed.
Yes, and we are going to be talking about Korea and tariffs in the United States. So before we get into those topics, let's talk about old news. Do we have any old news, Jay?
Well, I was curious to see. Last week we talked about the West Virginia teacher strike, and I was curious to see if there was any resolution to that.
So it looks like the legislature did pass a increase to their pay, about a 5% increase, which is what they were demanding.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the commentators have been saying that this doesn't really address a lot of the underlying problems, why the West Virginia teachers are drowning in debt, their medical situation, the healthcare cost. It doesn't address the union contracts and a lot of the underlying problems that really led to the strike. So this is more of a Band-Aid on the situation more than a fix.
So do you think that means that there's just going to be another possibly bigger strike later on?
Well, they kind of pointed back to the 1960s and 70s whenever there was the last time there was a lot of problems with the teachers unions in the United States. And they said that at one point we were having 200 strikes a year. And it was because they were never addressing the underlying issues. So I think it definitely, because of history, I think it would be an indicator that if they don't go back and actually address the substantive problems with the teachers' pay, with their situation, then we're going to see another strike in 2 or 3 years. And we may see more strikes across the United States. I think Oklahoma actually escalated its situation since West Virginia has resolved theirs.
Interesting. I did see a kind of positive story that came out of this where the teachers who went on strike recognized beforehand that shutting down the schools would mean that the children who receive free lunch and free breakfast wouldn't be able to access that while the school was closed. So the teachers and the teachers unions actually got together and provided lunch for those disadvantaged children who were dependent on those programs. And it just sort of illustrated how the teachers had the best interest of the community in mind while the politicians really didn't.
Well, it shows that they were not malicious. This was not something to hurt the community. It was not something because they were selfish. This was because they were hurting. Mm-hmm. And they needed the legislatures to understand there needed to be pressure. I love that one quote from Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from an Alabama prison where he says, I'm against violence, but I'm not against pressure. Because until the people who are not affected by the situation start to feel the pressure, they're not going to do anything. Mm-hmm. So this is why the First Amendment, enshrines this ability to, protest and air your grievances against the government. It's because you've got to be able to bring the pressure, get them out of the, capital mindset, get them out of the lobbyist, grasp, and show them that the people are being affected by their decisions. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's all for the old news. That's really the only resolution I see right now. So let's get started. So first topic today, tariffs. Jay, I think this is your topic. So you want to start us off?
Yeah, I wanted to talk tariffs and trade wars. Are they winnable? And how stupid is this one?
Well, it's very stupid, I think, is the first thing I would have to say.
Right.
And I think a short survey of the history of tariffs show you that generally the negative aspects of them outweigh any positive benefits that they may bring to the table.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's one of those issues, kind of like the border wall, that when you're giving it a 30-second pitch, it sounds great. It's like, hey, these foreign producers are able to dump these underpriced goods on us, and it's squeezing out our domestic manufacturers. What are we going to do about it? Well, let's slap a tax on it so that it's competitive. That sounds great, doesn't it? But then once you actually dig into it, what happens in reality is your domestic producers then raise prices to be just below the new tariffed price. So the benefit is passed to a very small group of domestic producers, while the people who actually suffer from it are us, the consumer.
Yeah. No, it definitely becomes a problem. And also it puts strain on our relationships abroad. Post World War II, the United States was kind of the champion of the globalization effort. We were the ones who said, hey, the only way we're going to prevent these global wars is by having an interconnected economic system. And so we fostered that for the last, 70 years?
Right.
And now we're at a place where we have people wanting to return to isolationism, protectionism, nationalism. These are not good policies in a global economy. And so when you slap these tariffs, they're not just directed at China, as Trump seems to indicate in all of his speeches, but they're going to affect Mexico, Canada, South Korea, all of our allies. And that's going to cause them to have to retaliate domestically as well. Whenever South Korea hears that the United States is putting a 30% tariff on steel imports, the domestic, politics have to respond. And so we now have this escalating domino effect across the world. And so I believe that looking at any past trade wars, you see that they don't win. No one wins these wars. They just ultimately de-escalate in some fashion, usually through, a regime change or through people realizing, hey, this is actually hurting us. So maybe we need to find a way to back down and, try and save face.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the fact that we've been operating under a set of rules for world trade for the last 70 years since the last war. And we have all benefited from this. The number of people in poverty has been declining significantly, particularly because of improving industrialization in the developing world. So the current tariffs are a massive threat to that. And I want to get into that, but first I want to first examine these specific tariffs, because when you look at the numbers, the impact of these tariffs economically, it's really not that much. I think it's a little bit overblown. So what he's proposing is a 25% tariff on steel, 10% on aluminum. This would amount to about $46 billion in trade, which is only 2% of imports total. 2%. This is going to impact GDP by $30 million. But to put that into context, GDP totally last year was $20 trillion. So this is going to amount to something like 0.003% of GDP as an impact. So the overall impact, not that big. They say the
now,
tariffs...
is this in regards to increasing domestic production of steel, like a $30 million increase in GDP?
No, this would... they're saying this is going to harm the economy by $30 million because it's going to create 33,000 metal making jobs, but it's going to destroy 179,000 metal dependent jobs, meaning that the people who can benefit from the higher price steel and aluminum, they're going to be able to increase production because the price is higher. But the people who then buy that steel and aluminum are going to have to pay more for it. So they're going to have to lay people off because their costs have gone up.
Mm-hmm. So I think that they've been talking about the industries that will be affected. Definitely the canning industry, Budweiser, Coke, all these guys, they're going to have to pay more, which they're just going to pass that on to the consumer. So ultimately, who's paying for this tariff? It's us once again.
Exactly. And the whole rationale behind this for Trump is about the trade imbalance, because he sees it as if we are buying more from China than we're selling to China, well, then we're losing. And that's just not reality. That's not how economics works.
Well, we don't have a pure production economy anymore. We have moved to a consumer service-based economy in a lot of industries. Mm-hmm. And so, because of globalization, we don't focus on production here. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the benefit. Now, I know, with domestic politics, everybody complains about NAFTA and saying that all the jobs are leaving, but that's capitalism. Economic, sorry, lost my train of thought. The aspects of the economy are going to flow towards the most efficient use. So if it's cheaper to build something in China and then sell it in the United States, they're going to do that. That's the whole point of globalization. So we have to address domestically the changing economy and say, instead of trying to save steel jobs, let's focus on creating more service jobs, more, college jobs, more types of jobs that are, white collar instead of blue collar, because our industry is moving that direction.
Right. So now that we've established that, first, these tariffs aren't going to work, and second, they wouldn't even fix the problems that they're supposed to create. Let's talk about why they are so worrying. And the reason is that this is a threat to global trade. And I really don't mean to exaggerate that, because of the way that these tariffs were introduced. Like, have you heard anything about this? How the rationale behind these specific tariffs
So
is
my
it's based on
understanding,
national security?
yeah, my understanding is that there is an article in one of the statutes that the government has that allows them to add a tariff or do some type of taxing for national security purposes.
Right.
Trump is making the argument that if we don't have a strong steel and aluminum industry here, if a war breaks out, we wouldn't be able to produce the tanks and airplanes and all the things that we would need to fight it. So under national security, we're adding this tariff to strengthen our domestic steel and aluminum production.
Right, exactly. So why is this worrying? Well, to back up, we are a part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And what the World Trade Organization is basically when you join up, you give up the ability to put restrictions on foreign competitors, but in return, you get open access to foreign markets to sell your own goods. And if you feel like someone has wrongfully put a tariff on you, you can ask the WTO to resolve the conflict.
And I believe that recently, like under the Obama administration, the United States brought multiple grievances to the WTO for China's conduct.
Yes.
So, and I think the United States won at those hearings. So now we're turning around doing about face, and all of our allies are going to be filing complaints with the WTO, and we're going to be the ones that's ignoring the decrees of the WTO.
Exactly. The problem here is that the treaty that set up the WTO allows us to do this. There's an article in the treaty that allows any member to create tariffs in the interests of its own security. And it's very loosely defined. And in fact, I think what I read was that there actually has never been a case brought to the WTO courts that they had to make a decision on based on this national security clause, because everybody's a little bit afraid of it and they just sort of give up before they get to it. It's a nuclear option because it completely destroys the entire dispute process.
Yeah, but if we've learned anything about this administration, they don't have any problem with going on the nuclear option. Hello, Justice Gorsuch.
Exactly. So let's talk through the options that the other countries, we'll call them the victims. Maybe that's not the best term for them, but the people who are
victims.
Yeah, the potential people who are going to feel the effects of this tariff. This is principally the like you mentioned. It's not even really China.
Well, it's not even China. Here's the thing:
Mexico, Canada, South Korea.
We produce 2/3 of our own steel already. Okay, we just consume so much steel that we can't keep up production, so we have to import. And I think we import most of our steel from like Canada, Mexico, and South Korea.
Right. Would you like to hear a list of countries that we import more steel from than China?
Sure, absolutely.
So first of all, the EU collectively, then Canada, Mexico, South Korea, Brazil, Japan, Russia, Taiwan, and Turkey. So we import more steel from Taiwan than we do from mainland China. But China's the boogeyman here.
And see, this gets back to like fear-based politics. Like this has been Trump's MO from the beginning. It's all about fear. It's all about, deception, fake news, misdirection. This is why people need to be listening. People need to be looking, reading, researching. Don't just listen to Fox News, Fox and Friends, and say that that's your, international policy advisors.
Right. This whole national security thing, it's complete bull. There's no basis for it. If it really was, they wouldn't be singling out China as the object of the problem. The fact that we import more aluminum from Russia and China than we do steel, but the tariff on aluminum is less than half of the one on steel. Like, there's no connection between national security and this tariff. It makes no sense at all.
Well, he does want to piss off Putin too much. Don't bite the hand that feeds.
Right. So let's talk about now what happens for the victims of the potential victims of this tariff. So here are their options. First, they could do nothing. They could neither retaliate nor file any complaints with the WTO. Well, then Trump wins because he's been able to successfully bully the rest of the world with his nonsense economic policy. So that's not a good option. If they file a grievance with the WTO, what the experts say is they're actually likely going to lose because the national security provision of the treaty is so broad that they usually defer to the country itself. So if they go to the WTO and they win, that's potentially even worse because now we have Trump able to say these intellectuals in Switzerland, these activist judges, they think they know more about American security and American national security interests than we do. Can you believe that?
Well, and also this is going to go with the whole anti-intellectualism that the right has.
Exactly.
And they're also going to say, look, this is just like the UN trying to overreach and, invade and violate our sovereignty as a nation.
Exactly.
And decide whether or not we need to secure some type of strategic resource.
Exactly. A lot of experts are saying that if that happened, that could actually be the pretext that they use to pull the United States out of the WTO. And that's just going to make everything worse.
It's just another step for isolationism.
Exactly. So the last option is they can not file any grievance with the WTO, but retaliate with their own tariffs anyway. And Trump still wins because that has revealed the WTO to be completely worthless and useless. So it's almost a genius strategic move by Trump, but it in the end, it's just going to end up hurting everybody.
Well, and this is also coming at a time whenever we have a lot of really delicate international situations going on, and this just kind of adds another layer of complexity onto everything that's happening with Russia, with the Middle East, with Korea, with even Japan. They're having a lot of crazy things happen in Japan, so it's really making the international outlook even more complex.
So what precedent does this set? If we're able to get away with this nonsense national security, completely bogus tariff, then what's going to stop China or India or anybody else from doing the same thing to us?
I think that's what's going to happen is we're going to see the national security article abused more often by states and nations to try and, I don't know, put pressure in other types of situations. I feel like Trump is saying, hey, you guys didn't obey the WTO whenever we won, so we're going to do something ridiculous, and no one's going to be able to stop us because we're going to go under this, specific article in the WTO. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of this is him trying to flex the United States economic muscle a little bit to show that we're still a world power, we're still, the biggest consumer economy in the world, and you can't push us around China. And so even if this isn't going to impact China, the fact that they can essentially get the whole world to bow down to a stupid move is just him flexing the super muscles, in my opinion.
Yeah. And it's not going to help anything. It's not going to even solve the problems he thinks it's causing. But have you seen any of the details of the proposed retaliatory tariffs from the EU?
Yeah, they're fantastic. They target specifically like Wisconsin with Harley Davidson and
right. Because of Paul
Kentucky.
Ryan.
Yeah, because of Paul Ryan, and Kentucky with bourbon because of Senate Majority Leader.
And orange juice from Florida. I'm not sure if that's just a red state thing or a Mar-a-Lago thing, but either way, you know what?
Mar-a-Lago and Rubio. Let's throw him in there. Remember?
Yeah. Take that, Marco. So I do want to concede that the entire reason we're here in the first place is that the WTO has been ineffective in limiting the effects of Chinese state-owned enterprises. there really is underpriced steel being dumped on the world market by Chinese state-owned enterprises, and that's not good. That's a real problem, but this is not the way to solve it.
Well, this brings up an interesting historical aspect. Back under the Reagan administration, um, during the 1980s, we kind of had an issue where there's gas shortage from the 70s. There's cars that are way under efficient on fuel, and Americans are starting to buy more Japanese cars, Toyota, Honda, all that stuff. And so the Japanese are just pumping cars into the American market. And the U.S. auto comes to Reagan and says, "Hey, we need some breathing room. They're drowning us, and we're not going to be able to keep up." So he essentially threatens to do a tariff. And the Japanese ultimately voluntarily slow down their production because the interpersonal relationship between the two countries was so intertwined. The United States has to defend Japan if anything happens. Their economies are very integrated. Japan relies on the United States for a lot of things. So the Japanese says, well, because of this international community we have, we're going to back off and kind of voluntarily try and increase the relationship between the United States and Japan, make it better. And so ultimately Reagan backed down. So I wondered if Trump was trying to do that, but since it wasn't targeting China specifically, it doesn't have any muscle against them, And so it's like they want to cite to this decision. See, Reagan was strong on this. He did this before. We can do it. But Reagan's situation was so specific to address a specific issue, and it was with an ally, not with someone who we're constantly, bickering with over trade and over currency manipulation and, stuff like that, and power in the region.
In a world where China has increased... Thank you. But in a world where China has increasing influence, we don't need to be retreating. We need to be, if anything, increasing our own influence. And the way to do that is to build bridges to allies. We could be banding together with other countries like Japan, Korea, and Europe, who are also feeling the negative effects of unfair practices. We could be banding together, but instead we are alienating them. And this is only going to make things worse.
And I hope that the people in America realize that this isolationism and protectionism, it's what led to World War I and World War II. It's what led to all these international conflicts. Truman was right post World War II. The only way to prevent these escalations is by having a system that's integrated, where everyone needs each other. It's like if we don't have China, we don't have all these precious metals we need to make our electronics and our right. Smartphones, computers, because most of those precious metals are in China. We realize we have to have these countries in the future. We have to have these relationships. And so instead of being worried about beating our chest and who has the biggest missiles, let's focus on building bridges and solving these problems internationally with diplomacy. I love this. Someone told me one time that politics, international politics, kind of is like oil. It helps the gears turn and prevent from grinding, but it's it's greasy, it's nasty, you don't want to get it on you, but it's necessary, and that's kind of how I feel politics is across the board. But since we've had this era of international politics and diplomacy, we've had less international conflict. Now we still have some, But think about it. We haven't declared war since World War II. Everything after World War II is a policing action, So the international community, the UN, the WTO, these things are working, but they probably need a little more teeth and a little more strength. And when you are dealing with superpowers, the last thing a superpower wants to give up is any type of strength.
So you've identified international diplomacy is one of the reasons of the lasting peace since World War II. And I think you're absolutely right about that. But I would also point the finger a little bit more strongly at world trade itself as the reason for rising peace within nations. Are you familiar? I can't remember exactly what it's called, but it's like the Big Mac theory about peace.
No, I have not heard the Big Mac theory on peace.
Up until in 2008, when Russia and Georgia had that brief war, Up until that point, there had never in the history of this world been a war between two nations that both had a McDonald's.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That is interesting.
And while, obviously McDonald's has nothing to do with world peace, it is a barometer of world trade. Basically, if there's a McDonald's where you are, then you've opened up your market to the world.
Or as some would say, you've become Americanized.
Sure.
So, but isn't that also kind of the reason we're having the cultural conflict in the Middle East?
Sure.
So there are some setbacks to this international globalization, obviously, and cross-culturalization.
Sure.
I think that's part of the problem we're having in America is we're being, I don't want to say forced, but it's almost like our system, our country was set up to become the melting pot to test this cross-culturalization. And I feel like that's the right reason why we have this huge divide in our two parties is one party is set up to say, no, we don't want to change our culture. And the other party is saying, we got to let everybody be everybody. We got to accept all these different cultures and bring them in and integrate it together. So I don't know. These are really, really complex situations.
Right. And I still want to stress how important organizations like the WTO, diplomatic organizations, I want to stress how important those are. Because while I 100% believe in free trade, that's one of my fundamental ideals. However, there's going to be assholes out there, and you need a dispute resolution system to deal with those assholes.
That's true. I mean, the downside of capitalism is essentially based off of human greed. You will want to buy stuff, you will want to have things, so you will go work a job, you will go contribute to society so that you can buy those things. I mean, it's like the simplified version of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, that system can be abused. It's why we have laws against monopolies, against cartels, stuff like that. And honestly, I think that one of the things that we probably need to look at is giving teeth to the WTO. Because honestly, we do have international cartels that are running the diamond and oil industries. We do have, and that we have these mini trade wars between Saudi Arabia and OPEC because Saudi Arabia hates Iran and wants to hurt their economy. So we need to give the WTO teeth so that they can actually do something whenever these, trade disputes break out.
You say that, but my knee-jerk reaction to that is against giving up sovereignty.
Well, and I think most Americans are against giving up sovereignty. And I'm not saying giving up sovereignty. I'm saying give the WTO the ability to retaliate if you don't play by the rules. I mean, this is the progression. We have said, hey, the only way to build globalization is by having this interconnectedness. At some point, that progression has to keep continuing. The UN needs to actually be some type of one world organization that can actually do something.
Whoa.
I mean, I'm being honest here. This is the progression of humanity. You're not going to be able to colonize the stars and, see the farthest reaches of the galaxy if you're still bickering over who owns what land here on this little tiny planet. So I mean, nationalization, all that stuff, this protectionism, it goes against how we are progressing as a species, in my opinion. So these things were useful for a time, but ultimately, I think there's something bigger out there for humanity. So focusing on whether or not you're from Texas or from Brazil or from China, these things ultimately are irrelevant at the end of the day. So that's my opinion. And maybe that's a arbitrary and capricious opinion, but I think we need to move past these little petty squabbles and move on to things that are more important. Like the giant space station that's falling out of the sky from China?
Oh, is that happening?
Yeah, it's like a 40-ton space station falling out of the sky.
Is it designed that way or?
No, I don't think so. I think that it was just kind of like China built their spaceship, and China may be able to build things really fast and really cheap, but you kind of get what you pay for.
Yeah.
Because this space station was up there less than the International Space Station was. So
that's frightening.
It is frightening, and actually a lot of people have been concerned about it.
Well, speaking of some weird news, what was the weirdest news that you saw this week?
I love this story because it's so ridiculous, but by far the weirdest news was that on Monday morning of this last week, the Utah State Bar, which is an organization that licenses and governs the attorneys for the state of Utah, sent out an email blast to all 11,000 lawyers in the state with a picture of a topless woman. And so it created quite a stir in the conservative state of Utah. And there are investigations into how this has happened and who was behind this. But the best thing has been the social media response, which most people were calling it the Utah State Topless Bar.
Nice.
So I thought that was pretty funny, especially being a lawyer and being a part of the Texas State Bar and understanding the system. It's funny that something like this would happen.
Very funny.
Also, probably only like 7 attorneys opened that email.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. This might be a dangerous question to ask on the record, but number one, do you get emails from the State Bar? And number two, do you ever open them?
Definitely when they are regarding CLE stuff. If there's like continuing legal education opportunities that I can take advantage of, I'll look at. But I don't pay attention to who is our local, State Bar president or anything like that.
Yeah, he sends us an email like every week, every month, and I don't know, what am I supposed to read that?
Probably. I mean, we should probably vote. I mean, if we're being honest.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess young attorneys are more focused on getting their job done than playing politics.
Sure, but I do think it's particularly funny that this happened in Utah, of all places.
Yeah, really. Like, what were you doing at the office that morning before sending out your news blast?
Yeah. Have you ever been to Utah before?
I've only been once, and it was Salt Lake City in the wintertime, and it was very, very miserable feeling.
Oh, that's too bad. I went just about probably about 2 months ago, and the weather was actually particularly nice, and everybody was super friendly.
That is a trait of Utahians, I guess. I don't know what they're called.
Utes, maybe?
Utes. I feel like that would almost be a insult. Utes.
Well, I think that's the Native American tribe.
Oh, I thought it was a thing that my cousin Vinny said. The Utes.
Oh, the Utes of America.
The Utes of America.
No.
Oh man. What about you? Any weird stories?
Yeah, I got a weird story from across the pond. What if I told you that the dispute between Kosovo and Serbia, going back to the war back in the 90s, what if I told you that dispute has caused people to be late for work across Europe?
I mean, that's interesting and weird.
Right? So what's going on is apparently your like run-of-the-mill standard like bedside alarm clock, along with the clocks on your microwave, your oven and such, all of those are regulated by the frequency of the electricity. That's how they tell the time. And if the frequency of that electricity changes, then the clocks are going to run fast or slow. So what's been going on is that Kosovo has been unable to generate the power that it needs. And Serbia, based on old treaties, is legally obligated to make up the difference if Kosovo cannot meet its obligations, because the power grid in Europe is actually just one continuous grid from Spain all the way across, with the exception of, I think, the Nordic countries and the UK. So if Kosovo doesn't create enough power and Serbia doesn't pick up the slack, then the entire grid sags a little bit, the frequency goes down. And so apparently everybody's clocks across Europe lost about 6 minutes since the beginning of January.
Wow, Europe's losing time.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? So
that is pretty crazy. And also that shows you how antiquated our technology and infrastructure is on this planet.
A little bit. It did not affect things like computers and smartphones, because those, things that connect to the internet, that's how they set their time. But yeah, I thought that was kind of crazy.
Also, who relies on microwave and oven clocks anymore to be on time for work?
Oh, you know what? There's a lot of old people out there. Like, have you ever watched the morning news? Because it still exists, and they still give weather reports and traffic reports as 50% of the content, which is something that you can look up at the blink of an eye on your phone.
I think I've watched more morning news on How I Met Your Mother as a joke than an actual real live morning news.
Yeah, exactly. Like, did you watch any of the Olympics?
No, I didn't, but I definitely want to talk about it.
Uh, the During the Olympics, there was a commercial that I saw several times on the broadcast for, I think it was called the Wonder Bible, who I'm hoping will be a sponsor one day. But
Wonder Bible brought to you by.
it was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever seen, because for $40 you get like a little plastic piece of crap that reads the Bible to you.
I saw this. I did see this. This is
Yes.
ridiculous.
And it's like, there are a million free apps for the Bible. Like, I'm not bashing the Bible at all. Like, if you want to read the Bible, go for it. It's a great book, but you can get it for free anywhere. It's the most public domain thing there is.
Literally.
You know?
It's the most printed book. You could go find a Bible somewhere. I have a bunch
Yeah.
of it just from my family.
I was watching the Joel McHale show last night, and he made a joke about this where he was like, "Hey Alexa, order me the Wonder Bible," and then Alexa says, "I could just read you the Bible."
That's funny. No, that's what's frustrating though. You know what that reminded me of? It reminded me of the Tim and Eric sketch where they had the MIDI like organizer, so it could like organize all your MIDI files. You know, the age of MP3. Who is making this stuff and who is buying it? You know,
right? Yeah, there's just a lot of people behind the times, and they come out of the woodwork. I used to work at Best Buy, and they came out of the woodwork to buy, home phones and things.
Like I could see like having a phone in an office because we have like Cisco phones at our office,
right?
But like I haven't had a home phone in 10 years.
Well, before we start talking like grumpy old men, what was it you want to talk about the Olympics?
So, well, the Olympics kind of ties into the grumpy old men. So I'm dubbing this segment "How the Olympics Saved Korea." So, we've had a conflict between Korea since the 1950s. And before we got into this, I want to kind of talk about why we're here, what happened. So after World War II, which Japan had conquered Korea, Korea goes back into its own sovereignty. But because of the involvement of Soviet Union at the very last day of the war, they had some say on what happened to Korea. And ultimately, two governments are established, one in the north, one in the south, one backed by the Soviets and one backed by the United States. Ultimately, they develop into a conflict. Both of them said that they were the official government of the continent. But they developed into a conflict. The Soviets quietly backed the North Koreans, and the United States and the UN backed South Korea. And so as the conflict continues on, China ultimately enters the war on behalf of the North Koreans, and there's a stalemate that ultimately develops at the 38th parallel. So an armistice is called, which is just kind of a ceasefire. There's never been a peace treaty in the Korean conflict. So technically today, the North and the South are still at war. So kind of fast forward to last year, we have the Olympics in South Korea, right? And I didn't watch any of the Olympics, but I did watch a lot of the politics around the Olympics. And so prior to the Olympics, we have the South Korean government reaching out across, the 38th parallel to the North Korean government and inviting them to come and participate in the Olympics. And so this is a big move. Now, you might wonder, why is this happening now? Well, in 2017, the South Korean government, the leader of the government, got impeached for allowing a friend who had no government position to have input on, domestic and international affairs. And so they impeached their president and elected a new government. And this new progressive government that took office was run by Moon Jae-in. And so he instantly signaled that he wanted to address the North Korean conflict with diplomacy. And so he's been working towards this ever since he took office. Now, at the same time, the South Koreans are working towards diplomacy. We have Trump over here, the United States, escalating things with North Korea. So it's been crazy. I know this has to be really frustrating for the South Koreans. They're wanting to try and finally resolve this thing. And Trump is getting, like oscillating between bellicose and reasonable at sometimes. So we have the Olympics, And the Koreans actually have a united banner team where there were members from both North and South Korea participating in the Olympics together. And there were people from North Korea, like I think Kim Jong-un's sister was at the Olympics, set 2 seats away from Ivanka or Pence or something like that. And so this was a big event for Korea. This was a really, really big event. And after the Olympics, the Southern delegates went up to North Korea, and they actually had good conversations about how to try and resolve some of these issues. And during these unofficial talks, which apparently were laced with Korean wine, they actually got to the point where Kim Jong-un was willing to talk denuclearization and put it on the table in talking to the United States. And so the South Korean delegation brings this to Trump and to the United States, and Trump goes out officially and says, okay, we'll talk. If you're willing to put that on the table, we'll talk. So what we have right now is we have an official commitment by the President of the United States, and we have telephone from North Korea to South Korea to us. So we're walking into this negotiation, number one, in a really precarious situation. Usually when there are these types of big talks, the low-level underlings are the ones kind of working out all the groundwork and getting everything set up, and then they bring in the decision makers at the end. We're starting with the decision makers at the very beginning with this discussion because it's Kim Jong-un and Trump.
Let me ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
So first, I'm paraphrasing, but I believe within the last couple of days, Trump was asked, what is the difference? Why has their stance changed? Why are they willing to talk now? And his response was me, that it's because of his style and his policies that it's brought them to the table. So number one, would you agree with that? And number two, do you think that having someone like him, somebody who sees himself as a negotiator, a deal maker, do you think that is valuable in this sort of a situation?
Okay, I want to address this kind of 3 ways. Number one, I think that the hero of this story really is the new president of South Korea, because he is the one who has been pushing diplomacy underground. He was the one who invited the North Koreans to the Olympics. He's the one that's sending delegations up there and trying to temper everyone's anger over the last few months. What was it, 2 months ago? Trump saying we're going to rain down fire and fury on North Korea, and North Korea is launching missiles. Now the South Koreans have got the North Koreans to commit to not testing any new nuclear weapons, any new missiles, and talking about denuclearization. But there is kind of like an asterisk to that statement. So we'll talk about that in a second. But,
so you're saying that you'd put more of the credit to Moon Jae-in than to Trump?
Yes, but I am going to give Trump some credit here, because I do think by getting China to put pressure on North Korea, and China being North Korea's really only substantive ally and trade partner, that probably was the thing that pushed them to the edge. Now, if you notice, when we did these things, whenever we increased our sanctions on them, we got China to put sanctions on them. What happened immediately was the North Koreans started testing more stuff, and that's what escalated everything. I think that really what happened was that put pressure on the South Koreans to amp up their timetables and put, pressure on diplomacy more. Because honestly, if that cycle had continued without North or South Korea being the mediator, we would have been in war, So you eliminate the South Korean delegates, and if they're on the side of Trump and we're continuing to escalate, by the time we're doing our spring, training with the South Koreans, the North Koreans are, launching missiles all over the place, and it's just getting worse. So I still think at the end of the day, the hero of the story is the South Korean government. But I do think that the pressure gave the South Koreans the ability to extend the hand, and gave, I guess, Kim Jong-un the opportunity to kind of say, okay, fine, we'll work with you, and you kind of bring us to the table.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that now that they're at the table, having this legendary businessman, do you think that's valuable?
No, and this is why, is we have put ourselves in a terrible negotiating position. And this is why he's not a great businessman. And this is why everything is not, this is why someone who doesn't have any understanding of international politics or the system thinking that they can just, go in there and negotiate as the great businessman is a fallacy. And the reason why is this. Number one, our State Department is still in shambles. Both the North Korean and South Korean ambassador positions, I believe, are empty. We have no one over there. That's the reason why the delegates had to come over here to talk to us. They had to actually bring the news to Trump because we didn't have anybody. The chain of command is empty. And so because you don't have the underlings on the ground trying to, work the deal out and get it hammered out to the final extent, that means that whenever a position changes or we need to contradict ourselves, that's Trump having to change the position and contradict himself. So now that hurts his credibility. If the guy working on the lowest level of the embassy is bringing an idea up and it doesn't work, they can just bring in someone else the next time and, not lose any credibility. But now we're dealing with Trump. We're at the highest level. And so we've committed to say, hey, we'll come to the table and talk, which is a concession. We've said, no, we're not going to talk with you guys. You guys are still testing nuclear weapons. You're still doing all this stuff. We're not even going to talk with you at the same table. So now we've conceded that. And we've said it, on Twitter and on, official statements, even though Rex Tillerson said we're really far away from the table, Secretary of State. So the White House and the Secretary of State's not even talking to each other right. But, I think that we now have to get denuclearization. If we don't get denuclearization, the North Koreans win because they haven't come out and officially committed to anything. They've only committed to stuff through the South Koreans. That's a lot easier of a position to back away from than from something that you're blasting on Twitter and saying on the news to try and garner favor and political points domestically.
Well, I want to stress that having them at the negotiation table is a win. That is a win. That's an improvement on Fire and Fury. However, we need to temper our expectations for the outcome of these talks, because North Korea does have a history of coming to the negotiation table using denuclearization as a bargaining chip in order to roll back sanctions and receive aid, and then just completely disregarding them.
This is true, and also there is a difference of understanding of what denuclearization would be. A lot of the commentators were saying this morning that whenever the United States says denuclearization, we're saying, hey, North Korea, you're giving up all your nuclear capabilities, and it's happening now. The North Korean understanding of nuclearization, according to the experts in South Korea, is that they would slowly scale back, reduce their armaments at a rate equal to that of maybe the United States. So they're expecting the United States to come in here and reduce their arms in return for their disarmament. So that's definitely going to be a no-go for Trump. I think we can all say that. And that's why I think that because we haven't had the low-level negotiations to hammer out the final deal, Trump's walking into a negotiation with a misunderstanding as to what's on the table.
Let me pose you a crazy, arbitrary, and capricious question.
Okay.
Let's just say hypothetically that the next president is a complete reformer, and one of their ideas is denuclearization for the United States. That we give up our nukes as a leading example to the world to encourage the rest to give theirs up too. Do you think that A leads to world denuclearization, or do you think that's just the dumbest thing somebody could do?
I think without some type of international body that could police the world and ensure that everyone was denuclearizing, I don't think that the United States would ever do it. I think that we are the superpower of the last century, and I think that the place that we have to realize where we're going is to choose how we're going to lose this superpower, because I don't think that any empire stays forever. And I think that with the advent of globalization, we're going to see things changing much faster. I definitely believe the next century is either going to be the global century or the China century. So the United States has the opportunity to push globalization and try and create an international system that works, or they can try and keep control of their power and ultimately lose it due to the economic strength of China, and then China is now the dominant role. And so you got to remember, United States, 6% of the Earth's population. 6%. That's a very small amount. you know?
Mhm.
So I think that ultimately we do need to denuclearize. I don't think that these weapons are really beneficial. They're just weapons of mass destruction. But there are so many nuclear weapons in Russia, China, Pakistan, India, um, all over the world. Israel has them, France has them, England has them. Until we have some type of governing agency that can police the world and make sure that these things are taken care of, I just think it's not prudent to do so.
Okay, so arbitrary and capricious question number two. Your prediction for how this ends. Do you think we actually have to go to war with North Korea, or do you think they denuclearize through a diplomatic process?
I think the gambit that South Korea is trying to run is that they're trying to go for reunification. And so if and here's the thing, we're what, 3 generations down from the uh, dictator that started the Korean War. This is his great grandson, right? Or his grandson.
Right.
And he doesn't seem like, you look at Kim Jong Un, he definitely looks like a man child. And he definitely acts and talks like a man child. But he doesn't seem hard. Like, he doesn't look like Khomeini or like, Osama bin Laden, doesn't talk like them. When you listen to his fiery rhetoric, it's almost like watching Cartman say something ridiculous. So I don't know. Maybe he's seeing that having a country of starving people and people that are brainwashed into believing that you're the greatest is not as good as having a thriving, role in this international community. So I think that's what the South Koreans are going for, and I hope that that's what the North Koreans are going for. And I'm hoping for reunification of the continent underneath the South Korean model, and that the lives of the North Koreans are improved. I think that will take denuclearization like fully, and I think that there's no way in hell that Trump gives up a single nuclear weapon for that purpose. So it's going to have to be aid, technology, infrastructure building, all of that stuff. Have you seen that famous picture of like Korea from space, where South Korea is just like lit up and then it's black all
Right.
across North Korea?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they are still in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't progressed. And so at some point, even Cuba, with Cuba kind of shifting and changing and wanting to better its relation with the United States and the Obama administration, they're kind of starting to modernize. Like, my sister works for a local church, and they've gone to Cuba now a few times for, evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
But 5 years ago, if someone was telling me they were going to Cuba, I'd be like, that's illegal. You can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember whenever Michael Moore, after he took a bunch of 9/11 first responders to Cuba to get health care in one of his movies, and there was like an investigation into whether or not he broke the laws against U.S. citizens going to Cuba.
Oh, wow. Jeez.
Yeah. So I mean, that was that was 5-6 years ago. So things are changing, and I think that the globalization model is working, but we can't become isolationists again. We're giving up our authority, our position, our opportunity to shape the global future of this planet because of, I don't know, guns. Sometimes I'm just frustrated with how people think.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So, all right. So that's basically where we are with Korea. Let's see. I think the talks are in May, and the South Koreans are really excited about this, and they're setting everything up. Oh, and one last thing. This is the reason why I think the South Koreans again show that they are the hero of the story, is when they got Trump to agree to this. The first thing they say is, "Oh, because of Trump's leadership in this situation, we have been able to bring it to this, resolution, or bring talks to a reality." I don't believe that the South Koreans believe that Trump's threats and increasing escalation really brought this dialogue to the table. I think they know that it was because they reached out hand and they used diplomacy, but they're feeding his ego because that they know that's the way you bring Trump to the table. That's the way you keep him willing to negotiate, is you praise him. So they're savvy, they're smart, and I think that they're the ones who are playing everyone and mediating this and hoping to get a real resolution out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but a lot of people don't believe that Trump's going to be able to do anything, especially on the right. I've seen like Tillerson is negative about it. A bunch of conservative commentators are saying that Kim Jong-un is pulling a fast one on Trump.
Yeah, my hope was that he would be more hands-off and hand it off to the diplomats. But as we talked about earlier, there are no diplomats because he hasn't appointed any.
The most understaffed administration in modern history.
That ought to be a subject for another day.
Absolutely. Now, okay, so moving on to our next segment. This is a new segment, correct?
Yes, sir.
So it is entitled Convince Me.
Yeah, the idea behind it is that Aaron and I, we do agree on a lot of things, but we also disagree on a lot of things.
This is true.
So I think we are going to challenge each other to convince each other of things.
So I think Jay has a idea for this first time. You want to give us the rundown?
Sure. So what I'd like to do is I would like to do kind of a blind resume kind of experiment where I'm going to describe to you a politician. This is a real person. I'm not going to tell you his name, and I'm going to be a little bit cagey about his resume because I think you'd probably recognize who it was if I gave too many details.
So this is going to be like the FISA warrant where you like say that there's a political person that's looking into something, but we don't tell you any details about it.
Yeah, kind of like that. And I'm going to try and convince you that this person should be our next president.
Okay, go for it.
So just to set the scene, I would say that I think what is needed right now is a centrist. In this time of division, I think we need someone who can actually unite us, who can take the best of ideas from both sides and create a situation that we can all live with. So this person, I think, fits that bill. This person was a successful Wall Street banker before launching his own company and entering politics later in life. Mm-hmm. He has 10 plus years of executive experience. You want to talk about specific issues? Well, let's talk about the big ones. He supports abortion rights as a basic human right. He supports government funding for stem cell research and has called the Republican stance on the issue insanity. He supports same-sex marriage on the rationale that government shouldn't tell you whom to marry. He opposes legalization of marijuana. However, when asked if he had ever smoked it in the past, he responded with, "You bet I did, and I enjoyed it." He supports strict gun controls and while in office, he increased mandatory minimum sentences for illegal possession of loaded handguns. On the death penalty, he prefers life imprisonment with hard labor. During his time in office, he oversaw sweeping reforms of the education system. This included a 15% raise for teachers, and all the while, they raised test scores and raised graduation rates. One of the biggest improvements that they made was they made a big push into after-school programs that were intended for at-risk and struggling students. Regarding climate change, he has spearheaded initiatives to protect the environment and prepare his constituency for the projected population increases over the next 30 years. On immigration, he's called the Republican stance unrealistic, and he likened immigration to the tide as something that as long as we have freedom and a good economy, people are going to try and come here, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Economically, he's a little bit more of a conservative. He favors free trade. He opposes protectionism. While in office, he turned a $3 billion deficit into a $6 billion surplus, partially through raising property taxes. And I think this quote from him is really key because what he describes himself as is a fiscal conservative, and that turns off a lot of people. But this is what he has to say. He says, being a fiscal conservative is not about slashing programs that help the poor or improve healthcare or ensure a social safety net. It's about insisting services are provided efficiently, get to only the people that need them, and achieve their desired results. Fiscal conservatives have hearts too, but we also insist on using our brains, and that means demanding results and holding government accountable for producing them. When asked about taxes, he says, taxes are not good things, but if you want services, somebody's got to pay for them, so they're a necessary evil. So,
But what was
Seems
his
reasonable,
action
right?
on taxes? Did he lower them? Did he increase them? Because that's a very kind of sidesteppy way of answering that question.
He increased property taxes in particular.
Okay.
And you know what? One of the biggest things from this past election was people wanted a businessman. People wanted Trump is a successful businessman. Well, this might give it away, but you want a rich businessman? He's worth 10 times what Trump is worth.
So is this Warren Buffett or is it the other guy in New York? I can't remember his name.
It is. It is former mayor of New York City, Michael Bloomberg.
Bloomberg. See, that's yeah. When you were, gosh, the worst part about him is the fact that he was a banker starting out, because that definitely was a big hit. Like, I definitely don't want a businessman running any type of politics. But Bloomberg has done a lot for New York, and he is a conservative, but he's like a New York conservative.
Right.
Like you said, on a bunch of the social issues, he tends to lean more liberal, but on the financial stuff, he is more conservative. But I don't know. That's an interesting choice. You think he would run as a Republican?
I think he's 76 years old, and there's no way he's running. I just don't think it's a possibility.
Okay, but hypothetically, if he was going to run, do you think the Republican base would even vote for him? Could he even get out of the primaries?
I don't think so. Not in the current Republican Party. There's no way.
Because I was going to say, when you said he's a conservative because he's against protectionism, I was like, well, that's the opposite direction we're going here.
Right. Well, that's the direction that Trump is going. I think if you look at Congress, the traditional Republican base is more free trade. But I think it is changing. But to get back to Bloomberg, he's old. He's Jewish. There's no way that in this current political climate that he'd be successful, and he knows that. I think he endorsed Hillary Clinton in the last election. In fact,
I'm pretty sure that he did. So I mean, but this gets back to the idea that what it means to be a conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat is changing. These definitions are kind of in a fluid state, and there is a potential for party breakups and for a multi-party system. But historically, the Democrats, Republicans tend to just absorb in factions as opposed to allow them to stand on their own 2 feet. I mean, what happened when the Green Party comes in? The Democrats get more interested in, the EPA and taking care of the environment. When the Tea Party shows up, the Republicans just absorb them into the infrastructure.
Right. So, how much did I convince you? Scale 0 to 10.
I mean, honestly, it's kind of like Kasich. Of all the Republicans that ran in the last election, Kasich was the most, in my opinion, palatable. And in some ways, my dad, who is like a diehard liberal, he said that he would vote for Kasich over Hillary a couple of times. So, I mean, there are some fiscal conservatives like Bloomberg that probably I don't disagree with a lot of things on, and who would probably uphold social values that are important under the Constitution, making sure that we're not just stomping on them because of our own personal beliefs. So I think he's definitely palatable. So I think you have arbitrarily and capriciously convinced me that Bloomberg would have been a good president if he wasn't 80.
Fantastic.
No. But yeah, I was like, it's either Bloomberg or Buffett. I was like, it's a lot of money, banker. Buffett never ran for anything, so.
Right. Well, before we wrap up, I want to check our mailbox to see if we have any listener questions.
Oh, fantastic.
All right. Looks like we've got one. This question is for Aaron. Mark in Croydon writes, Aaron, who killed Kennedy?
Who killed Kennedy? I do not believe in general conspiracy theories, so probably Oswald, who killed Kennedy. I definitely have gotten stuck downtown at the Kennedy assassination spot by the homeless people who tell you everything about the Kennedy assassination multiple times.
Right.
And pro tip, if you're ever walking around downtown Dallas in Dealey Plaza and you stop to talk to these people, have like $5, because if they talk to you for longer than 2 minutes, they're expecting you to pay them something.
Well, yeah.
But, and they tell you about all the different conspiracy theories. But I think it was just Oswald. I think that it just happened. It was just a bad event, bad time period. I don't buy into the conspiracies.
So you're so you're saying that it wasn't a second shooter or anything, but
No.
Do you think that Oswald was put up to it by, the mafia, the CIA, the pro-Cubans, the anti-Cubans?
I think he was just a sad, deranged person who
He's just a nut.
Just a nut. I mean, I think he had gone over to Russia, and maybe he was influenced by, anti-American sentiment or something like that. But they're just crazies in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the guy who tried to shoot, or the lady who tried to shoot Gerald Ford. She was just mentally unstable.
Yeah, like that guy who attacked Dan Rather, who kept shouting, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?"
Yeah. So that's the unfortunate aspect of our society, is there are crazies, there are lone wolves, and you can't always account for that. But I don't know. Anytime something big like that happens, there's always going to be conspiracy theories. And the fact that Jack Ruby, who was a part of the mob, kills Oswald, it definitely adds to the conspiracy. But this, growing up in Dallas, my grandparents always said that this event hurt Dallas for a long time.
Oh yeah.
Like, this was something that was associated with Dallas, and when people said Dallas, you thought about Kennedy and the assassination. And so it took a long time for Dallas to move on from that.
Yeah, they called us the city of hate.
The city of hate, yeah. And so the mob, if they're even like involved in this area, it's all about economies, right? And so if no one's coming here, no tourism, no new industry, no new business, that's bad. And I don't know what was it that Kennedy had done that would have pissed off any of these people. I mean, I understand the Cuban crisis, but I mean, that's a bit ballsy to get someone to assassinate the president over conflict.
People were really pissed about Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, they were.
And it's funny because it was one of those issues where it pissed off everyone.
Yeah.
Where the anti-Castro Cubans were mad that he didn't follow through enough with Bay of Pigs, that they didn't give enough support, while the pro-Castro Cubans were angry that any support was given at all.
But at the same time, I believe that the Bay of Pigs was set up under the prior administration, and like Kennedy comes in and they're like, oh, by the way, we're doing this. And it's just like, oh, okay. It wasn't Kennedy's idea. He wasn't orchestrating it or designing it,
Well, yeah, but people are unreasonable.
That's true. Yeah, usually crazies are not reasonable.
Yeah. Well, speaking of crazies, we want to encourage our listeners to send us questions. And the best way to do that is you can find us on Twitter at ArbCap Podcast. That's at ARBCAP Podcasts. You can also email us. We have a Gmail that is arbitrarycapriciouspodcast@gmail.com. You can find me personally on Twitter at JSuaSponte. So that's JaySuasponte. And if you...
I don't currently have a Twitter that is active, but will be, I guess, creating one, so you can contact me and send me questions about conspiracy theories. If you send me questions about conspiracy theories, the answers will all be no. So... Just generally, I don't buy into conspiracy theories. I mean, they're interesting to think about and to talk about, but at the end of the day, we are living in an era where fake news and conspiracy theories are outweighing legitimate news and legitimate facts and discussion. So I long for the days of the salon where people had intellectual discussions about stuff, as opposed to Facebook where they just post ridiculous echo chamber fake news over and over again.
And if you're not interested in intellectual discussion, tune in next week for Arbitrary and Capricious.
True that. So, have a great week. We will see you next time.
All right. See you.